Hello everyone and welcome to the week 2 lecture for game asset creation. So just to recap from last week, Blender will be our primary modeling tool. We had a look at some various parts of the UI, a rough process of taking a high poly model, a low poly model, baking the textures from one to the other and getting it in Unreal. So that's a quick overview of the course and the content we'll be learning, but obviously I glossed over a whole lot of details. So the first assignment and what we'll be covering today in the lecture is much more on the actual modeling tools and creating the low poly model. So there are a number of ways to do modeling. So there's box modeling, which is what we'll be looking at today, where you, generally speaking, start with a box or some other primitives, extrude the faces around, connect vertices, and generally stay in very low poly, no modifiers, no smoothing, and create the actual mesh that will be used in the game engine. The other two methods, generally speaking, are the high poly, which is generally done as a subdivision surface modeling. We saw that on the high poly version of the dagger last week. Effectively, you would go to the modifiers tab, add subdivision surface, and then each quad gets divided into first 4 quads and then 16, and then goes on in power of 2 from there. So that is a very efficient way to create very smooth, very detailed, very high-res meshes that are then used to bake down into the low-res, which we'll be creating first. The other method is sculpting, which I very much love my sculpting. We'll be covering that briefly in Blender. Sculpting is also very recommended process for programs like ZBrush or Mudbox. Very passionate ZBrush user as well. However, we will be sticking to Blender for the purposes of this course. So something worth mentioning again from last week's lecture, Blender's UI is very modal and very customizable, so any particular part of the UI can become any other part of the UI. What I mean by that is, this properties panel can suddenly become a text editor or a UV editor or a shader editor if you need that. So there is a layout and a modeling. The main difference between the two is that the timeline gets hidden and it puts you in edit mode already. So if we were to go back to layout, which is the default that will open, when you open a new file, start a new file, as soon as I click tab to go into edit mode, we get all these options back anyway, and there's a timeline there if you need it. So we'll just, for the most part, be sticking to the layout tab. Doesn't really matter if you wanted to add your own or use the modeling one, or jump between the various ones. That's entirely up to you, but for the purposes of making these videos easier to follow and consistency whenever you open a new file, we'll just stick to the layout tab and go from there. Before we go any further, we'll just delete that modifier there. So another concept to get across with Blender and modeling is this cube here is an object named cube that contains a mesh named cube. So generally you won't have to think about this too much, but if I was to duplicate this object and then make a modification here, this is now cube.001, which contains mesh cube.001. So there's 2 objects and 2 meshes. 1 mesh is assigned inside each object. The only reason I'll sort of bring this up, if I was to shift select that, Control L, you can then link the mesh data inside one object to the mesh data inside another. So this is handy for instances. So if I was to do link object data, now they both become cubes. That's not particularly useful looking at this point, but now if I edit one object, it'll edit the other one automatically. So this can be handy if you're modeling something more complex, something that has a lot of sort of repeating parts to it. So if you're modeling a computer keyboard, most of the keys have a unique sort of profile to them, but are the same as most of the other keys. So you could create one keyboard key, create a whole bunch of objects and then reference the mesh to one of the keys, and then just edit one key, and then all the other keyboard keys would snap to that same sort of shape. So don't worry about that too much. We won't really be needing it for this practical or assignment 1, but when I'm going through the various settings, and you'll see that there's the object cube and the mesh cube, which pertains to the object panel here with the object related settings, and the mesh here with the mesh related settings. That's what's going on. So again, you don't really need to use it, but I just thought I'd cover it because that can be a bit confusing for people just sort of starting out and wondering what is going on and why there's two sets of options within the user interface. One of the things that got overhauled between version 2.8 and the versions of Blender before it is there are a lot more graphical icons. So these options were, there before, but generally represented as a text button. But yeah, now they're just a lot easier to see and interact with. As a long-term Blender user, I generally refer to the keyboard shortcuts. I've turned back on screencast keys, so if I accidentally gloss over anything, be sure to check the bottom left of the screen again, and it should be recording my keystrokes as we go. So this cube is in edit mode as opposed to object mode. So object mode, again, just to recap, is where you sort of move an object around, scale it, rotate it, assign a material to it. However, edit mode is where you directly interact with the parts of the mesh. So the core ones are the vertices, so each point where things intersect, the edges, which you can select with this these three buttons up here. So if I was to select an edge, that's an edge between two faces that joins between two vertices, and faces, which is the face that makes up the object. So faces can be quads, which is a polygon with 4 sides. That's generally what you want. However, when things get into a game engine, they will be split into tries. So there will be a diagonal drawn either across that line there or that line there, and each poly will be represented as a pair of tries. Each quad, sorry. You can also have a poly with more than 4 edges. So if I was to subdivide that edge, we now have an extra vertex here. So that is now one face with made up of 5 edges and 5 verts. Generally speaking, you don't want that. So it can be helpful for the modeling phase and architectural models where you have to cut in a lot of windows to large flat surfaces and things. So it has its uses for modeling, but by the time you get to exporting your object to the actual game engine, you generally want to avoid having that happen at all. So just Control Z, or on the Mac I assume to be Command Z to undo, and Control Shift Z to redo. So there's generally quite forgiving undo settings within Blender. If you go to File, they moved that to Edit Preferences, System, there's the undo steps there. So depending on how dense your model is and how fast your particular computer is, you might want to turn that up. Generally leave it to 32 and things will stay stable, and that's fine. The only other setting while we're here is there is a CUDA setting for systems. If you have a graphics card, generally speaking a NVIDIA one with a lot of CUDA cores, you will want to go from cycles render vertices from none to CUDA and check your card. Not a huge deal, especially with the modeling, but for the texture baking, that will certainly speed up the rendering as well. So I'll just close that for now. So in terms of the very most basic things you can do with it, you can also select these options up the top here. This will let me select an edge or just a vert or a face at any one time. That's up to you, personal preferences. Do you want to leave these all on or not? Extruding, so the E key. this is sort of the basic way you would initially get anything going with box modeling. So extruding and scaling faces, a very quick way to get things underway with the shape of your model. Control plus or control minus will grow the selection or shrink it. And if I was to extrude that whole section, it'll take the edge, so those 4 edges of whatever I had selected, and extrude between those. So a more drastic sort of example of that might be if I had faces selected, that one, that one, that one, and extrude that whole region there. It'll create a ring of faces around that. So this is also generally what's referred to as topology. So if I was to alt click on an edge, that will select an entire loop of faces. This keeps things easy to manage when you're modeling, and also generally speaking, I mean, this shape isn't a great example, but having defined loops that are very clean also helps with the model deforming if it needs to be rigged or animated in any particular way. So yeah, we'll be covering that more as we go along, but yeah, edge loops and face loops are good because they keep things simple. So moving on from that, if I was to select a particular edge, turn off that tool, back to just the regular select tool. Control R. So if you've got an edge selected, and it'll, whatever edge you're hovering over, you'll see that because these have clean loops of faces around them, I can then cut edges into them. So I can cut the one edge, single left click, and then you'll get this option to slide the edge along. Control will also work for constraining it here. So this is going in, this is 10% away from that edge, 20, 30, 40. If you want it to be exactly centered, you can right click and it'll just leave it in the center there. So if you select Control R again to cut another edge loop, you can also use the mouse wheel to just really quickly add in a whole stack of loops. So this is probably more handy for the high-res model stage, but you may find it useful in the low poly modeling phase to cut more than one loop at a time as well. So left click to confirm that and right click to leave it centered. As well as adding in new edge loops and verts and faces. Obviously from time to time you'll want to remove some of those. So if you just click the X key, it'll bring up the delete menu. So you can delete these vertices, which will leave a hole in your mesh. You can delete the edges. So what that will do, and it's generally not what you want, is remove the faces and any connecting edges, but leave all the verts. So it's an option if you need it to sort of manually adjust the topology or whatever, but generally speaking, you don't really want to do that. Delete the faces will delete the faces, but at the moment we've only got edges selected, so that doesn't appear to do anything. However, if I was to select these edges as well, and then delete faces, it would delete any faces we have selected and then remove the selection. Delete edges and faces. There's a combination of the last two things we looked at, or only faces will basically appear to do what you were looking at before, where it'll just take that face and remove it. So also useful in this menu is deleting the edge loops. So that has deleted the loops we added in and just put these back to the faces they were with the regular, 4 verts for 4 edges per poly. And that can be very handy again for adding detail and removing detail at a very, very quick and efficient way of doing that. So if you've got 2 vertices selected like that and you want to merge them together, M for merge. You can merge them at the first vertice you had selected, the last one you had selected, the center between the two, at the 3D cursor, which is once again the red and white circle with the crosshair in the center of the scene. We covered that last week. or collapse. So at center does what you sort of think it was. Generally speaking, I either do at first, at last, or at center. But, depends on what you need it for. So if, for example, we have delete those vertices, we'll see that we now have a hole in the mesh. So if I was to Alt right click, that'll select all the verts and edges as a loop where there is a hole, and we can click F. So what that has done is given us one of those n-gons, so a polygon with more than 4 sides. Even though there isn't actually an edge along there, like I said, every n-gon is eventually going to be split up into tries, so it's doing its best to figure out sort of what you would want to do with that shape, and that's not really it. So a better way to do that would be to select these, fill that, and then Alt select these and then fill that, which behaves much more like we would sort of expect it to. You don't have to select each edge each time to do one face at a time. If you were to add in a whole bunch more loops and a whole bunch more loops this way, and then Alt select, we've got quite a number of faces selected, but there is actually an even number of faces to connect on that side as there is to that one. So if we deselect by shift left clicking these edges here, we can then hit the F3 key, which will bring up a search menu, and we can type what we're looking for, which in this case is bridge edge loops, and select that, and that will fill the faces in such a way that we keep our nice edge loops going that way, we keep our nice face loops, going that way. So when we're in face mode, we can select going that way, we can select going that way, and it's just a much nicer way of filling the object. So the next tool we will have a look at is the bevel tool. So if you've got a set of edges selected, actually it'll be easier to show on this edge here, we can then use the bevel tool. Or if we were to just use the shortcut key version, that would be Control B, and then dragging the mouse without holding any buttons down will do the bevel. So again, that can be constrained, but it won't actually snap if you're holding the Control key. It's just sliding between the various values. So what you can do here, and this is a little bit of a clunky way to do it, but if you were to type 0.01, that'll give you a bevel of 0.01, and you can delete here. This is actually showing up a little hard to show with the mouse while it's still in the tool, but down the very bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a bunch of text showing exactly what the tool is doing, and there are secondary keyboard shortcuts for it. So again, if I was to type in 0.1 here, or delete and go make a 0.2, that will bevel those edges for us. So it's also worth noting that once we've assigned the bevel, it's created 2 faces here that have 5 edges and 5 verts. So again, the n-gons. So that's just something to be aware of whenever you're using the bevel tool, because again, we generally want to avoid this. If I was to select an edge loop that was continuous from one end to the other, and then Control B for bevel, that will not be an issue because it'll bevel and effectively adds another loop as if you were doing the edge cut thing, but the edge you had in the center is gone, and there's now 2 edges either side of it. So that's the bevel tool. So next up is the inset tool. So if you have multiple faces selected or a single face and hit I, that will inset. So that is creating an edge loop around the faces that we are shrinking in at a uniform width. So that can be very handy for, say, if you were modeling something that then needed to extrude down and have a uniform wall width down that. Just undo a couple times there. Another tool, sorry if I'm running through these too quickly, but yeah, you can always feel free to ask questions in the practicals or any clarification on tools that I may have skipped or gone over a bit too fast. The knife tool, so that can be selected here, or the shortcut key for that one is K. So this is for, as the name knife implies, cutting between different edges or vertices along a face. So this is done in a series of points, and I'm left clicking to confirm each one. If I was to right click, that cancels the whole thing, which is generally applicable across Blender. If I was to hit K and go from one and then left click, if you get close enough, there's a little region where it'll snap on, which is very handy because you'll often want to cut between two vertices exactly. I can then hit enter to confirm, and that will have cut an edge, dividing that poly into two triangles. So this can also be done at different, doesn't have to be between the verts. You can cut wherever you sort of need it to cut. Once again, we've been left with the 5 edges on this particular polygon on the side here, so just make sure to watch for that. These edges, just like everything else, can then be moved around, whatever. So that is the knife tool. Further to that, if we've got a few faces that we want, and then we realize that we want to sort of remove this part of the mesh, there's 2 ways of doing this. We can either split that off by clicking the Y key. So this will keep the faces within the object, but it'll split them off. What I mean by that is that if we were to go back into object mode, this is all still treated as one mesh. So moving the object moves both of those pieces. If we were to go back tab into edit mode and hit P, that would say, do you want to separate this out into its own separate object, which can be quite handy as well. So if we were to separate that selection, it would separate out the faces we have selected. If we were to separate out by loose parts, that would take each of the different loose parts, which can be selected with L or Shift L for one continuous part. Or we can separate that out by material. So we'll get to material groups a bit more later, but just to show what that does, we select that one, select with L, P, separate by selection. So we're still in edit mode on this object, but this section is now removed and it's its own object, cube.001. So by default, Blender will give a new name to each object by just continually adding .001, .002. Naming conventions are very important, so it's best once you've duplicated something like that to go in and manually rename it yourself. But in order to keep things separate, Blender will numerically give a new name to each object that you create. So now that I have 2 separate objects here, if I was to tab back into object mode, H for hide, Alt H to unhide, these can then be moved separately. But if I was to select one and then select the other, again, the brighter orange on the most recently selected object means that that's the active one. I can hit Control P, and that will parent one object to another. So this and any other objects will be referred to as the child or children, and the active object will become the parent. So Control P for that, set parent to object. So now this one can be moved around independently. However, when I move the parent object, it'll move everything else around it. Again, this can be handy for creating object hierarchies. For the most part, in this course, we will be focusing on one object at a time. So eventually you'll want to merge all the children back into the one parent object. So to do that, if we've got one object and then again, select the active object last, Control J will join the 2 objects together. So now if we go back into edit mode, it's back how we were. This can be, again, very handy for if you've brought in another component of an object, or you've been working on the object in 2 separate pieces just because it was easier to see, and then at the end of the process you want to join them all into the one continuous object. So I've quickly just tabbed back out of edit mode into object mode again. So I can show you this little spanner tab here, which is applied to objects. So you want to be in object mode generally for this. Add modifier and mirror. So symmetry helps modeling a lot. A lot of the objects you will model will be symmetrical in one way or another. You can select which axis or axes you need it to be in symmetrical in. We were already symmetrical in the y-axis, so that doesn't appear to have done anything. But what it has done, if we were to tab into edit mode, A to select all, G to grab, is it's made, you've got the two individual halves of the object. So more often than not, you'll want symmetry on the x-axis. You can have symmetry on all three axes if you really want it, but generally just the x. So we now have overlapping faces, which we don't really want. If you want to see the vertices on both sides, you can select on cage as well. And that will show that we have these overlapping faces here. So the flickering, which is something you may have come across in playing other people's games or have heard about in other courses, is often referred to as Z-fighting. So the definition of what that actually is there are two faces sitting on exactly the same plane, and the rendering engine, whether it's Unreal 4's engine or in this case the Blender viewport, doesn't know which face you actually want to show on top of the other face. So in other courses you may have covered like alpha sorting, so sorting out which face should layer on top of each other face to show up in the rendering engine. No different here. So because these two are exactly the same, it doesn't know which one to show. So that's the thing you'll want to avoid when modeling, because not only does it give this visible flickering and error, it's a waste of polygons, really. We don't need two polygons in the exact same space because we just need one to show it. So what we can do here, there's a couple of options. If we were to check clipping, what this does is along the central axis, so we've got this mirrored along the x-axis, so this side is the same as this side here. If we were to hit G and grab and just move it, as soon as anything hits that central axis, it'll just snap to the center and not come across. So if we were to just do that there, so we've still got duplicate faces on the middle, and because they're kind of interior to our strange object that we're building here, you will want to delete those as well, because they're inside the object, they're not going to be seen, it's just going to add to the poly count, and there's not really a point to it. So if we were to just select that face, delete those, or if we were to click Z and go into wireframe mode, you'll be able to see them easily there. So B for border select, you can select multiple faces at a time that way, delete faces, and now if we go back to Z solid, which is generally the option you want, these options can also be changed with the little icons up here, but the Z key and the pie menu is the quicker way to get between them. This will now show us our mirrored object with the faces removed out of the center. We can then continue modeling, doing whatever we need to do, and it will be mirrored on the other side, which is very, very handy and a very efficient way to model. So if we were to tab out of edit mode into object mode, that mirror axis is also along the center of the object. So the center of the object is often viewed by the little bright orange dot, which is the object's pivot point. The axis along that pivot point is where the mirror will be applied to. If you need to apply a mirror or any other particular modifier that you've got, just click apply here. Now if we were to go back into edit mode, we still have all those faces from when we were mirroring, but we can change each individual side as we need to. So that might be a use case where you had an object that is mostly symmetrical. You'd have mirror on to start with, get the bulk of the model done, and then at the end of the process, just make those few changes where you need to add in the extra detail that's not symmetrical. So far, we've really been dealing with the one object, but if you click Shift A, that will bring up the Add menu. In this case, we're going to want to add a mesh object, but there are a whole range of different things you can add. You could add a text object, which will be editable text that then takes the form of a 3D mesh. Armature for rigging, whole range of different things, lights. But if we stick to the mesh menu for now, we'll see that we can add in a plane, a cube, a circle, which is just a ring of points, editable as a mesh, so it's not a spline by any means. UV sphere, an icosphere, so we'll just put in one of each of these to quickly show the difference. Again, if I select that mesh that we were editing before and click H for hide, so this is a UV sphere. The difference between the UV sphere and the icosphere, go to grab, constrain to X, move to the side, is basically how the polygons are laid out. So an icosphere is entirely out of triangles, and a UV sphere is quads except for the very top part here, which we'll see is a circle full of triangles going to a point. Again, depends entirely on what you need to use the mesh for. UV sphere I find to generally be far more useful. So if we were to select this one, delete, add in mesh UV sphere. Another thing to note is that down the bottom here, there will be this little menu, add UV sphere. So we've got the sphere in the scene, but we can change how many segments we need. So we might need this to be like 16 and then 10 rings just to be less polys. We can change the radius. It'll automatically give us some basic UVs on the shape and positions where that will go. So this menu here, if I was to then deselect the sphere and select it again, that menu is gone. So it only shows up immediately after you've added an object. Again, it's something you'll get used to. You may need it. You may not actually use this menu much at all, but that is what's going on with that little menu down there. Also worth noting that this has added a mesh as a completely new object. If we were to go in edit mode, left click in the viewport to deselect all faces, if we were to then move this to the side, Shift A, we get our add menu within the object. So if I was to then add a cone, this adds a cone within that mesh. So again, depends on personal preference, what your process is for modeling as to whether you want to add it as a separate object and join it in later, or whether you want to add it in edit mode. So if we tab back out into object mode, don't need these anymore, hit delete. Looks like we've got nothing in our scene, but if we check in the outliner, we can see that one object was hidden. So we've used hide and unhide a little bit here. You can also do this via the little eyeball icon in the outliner, or Alt-H will unhide everything in the scene that is hidden. So now we've got our initial object sort of back. Because we did Alt-H, it's just brought back every object, which in this case is one, but none of the objects are active. So if I was hitting Tab as the shortcut to get into edit mode, it's not actually doing anything. But if we left click the object, it goes the brighter orange, it's selected again. Just one of Blender's quirks to bring across in case that happens to you. So we can then go into edit mode or in and out via tab. And another handy tool that is good to know, often done with vertices but can be done with edges or faces as well, is the proportional editing tool. So if we move this vertex, we are moving one vertex at a time. If I was to hit the O key, then it'll enable this little button here, so we can also toggle it off with the button itself. This will give us a proportional edit. So to just show that, if we G for grab, there will be a fall off of the radius shown by that pale grey circle, which we can adjust the radius on the fly by scrolling the mouse wheel, and it will affect the vertices around it to a lesser and lesser extent as it gets further away. So this can also be changed to, let's say, a linear one, linear fall off, which means that, as you can see on the left of it there, it's keeping that straight edge, because everything sort of down from it is along a uniform amount away. It's not as clear on the other edges because that's, it's off to the side as well as being down along. So it's a linear fall off along that sphere. And that can be also changed to other options. Constant, not entirely sure why you would want that, because that's basically just the same as selecting all those verts and moving them as a group, but that's there if you need it. Smooth is the default and is generally what you want. This comes very, very much in handy for modeling, say, characters or trees or organic natural objects that have a sort of a flow and a taper to them. It can be useful for mechanical and hard surface modeling, but yeah, it depends on the shape. That could be useful for modeling car doors, for example, where everything needs to have a slight taper to it, but it's still in the end a hard surface mechanical shape. But yes, that is very handy. Once again, O key or this toggle up the top here. As well as the commands we've sort of looked at so far and the icons that are here, if you were to select a number of vertices here, right click will also bring up a context sensitive menu. So in edit mode, it will bring up, do we want to subdivide or like split and add a vert between those two that are there? Do we want to extrude, bevel? So a lot of the things we've been looking at will just come up from this context menu, including slide vertices, which we haven't really looked at. So this will take vertices, you can also do it with edge loops, and slide them along the existing edges. Why it's getting a bit funky in the middle there is because it doesn't know if you want to slide along that edge or that edge. But yeah, just move the mouse around, experiment a bit, and you'll find how that behaves. So being a context sensitive menu, if I was to just tab out back into edit mode, right click again, you would get, as to the object mode, different options for that here as well. So shade flat is what it currently is. Shade smooth will smooth all the normals out. You can also set that per face, but for now we'll just set that all back to shade flat. Can copy and paste, duplicate, which is Shift D, which we've I think done before. Rename, mirroring, parenting from one to another. Move to collection, collections being sort of layer groupings that we can have in here, and a range of different options. So again, if we would have a camera or a lamp, this right-click menu would change contextually based on what you've got selected. One more thing to cover for this week, which will lead directly into the practical and starting on our very first models. Reference images and setting those as a background image in the viewport. So just quickly on reference images, you don't need a full-on degree as a professional photographer to take decent reference images. They're basically just used to get the outline and proportions of the object. If you were doing a fictional item or a stylized item, this would often come in the form of concept art. This can be something you create yourself. In most game companies will have dedicated concept artists. They would draw images of front, back, and sides. Depending on the budget of the game, sometimes you might just get a single image that might be from a 3/4 view, and as a modeler you would need to be able to interpret that as front, back, left, top, right, and change it into an actual model. So it depends on the production as to whether you're getting reference images, drawn concepts, or a drawn front, left, right, center. Worth noting here that I have taken photos of the object, trying to minimize perspective distortion, but all real-world cameras will have perspective to them. I've also included a ruler in the shot. This can help with checking the scale. Obviously, again, because of perspective, the ruler in the top here is pretty much in line with the sort of center of the object. Depending on the object will depend on where the ruler will be most useful. On this lower image, the ruler is back a bit from the end of the object. It probably would have been better to put the ruler up flat against that surface, because that end of the pepper grinder is sort of where we're wanting the measurements. So yeah, just thought I'd leave that in there as an example of what could have been done a little bit better. So in terms of getting this actual image into Blender, first of all, you can just drag and drop, and that image will then be in there. Alternatively, you can Shift A for the Add menu, Image, and Reference or Background. Typically, you'll want to use the background option. Select the pepper grinder from this week, load image, and away we go. So this will load it based on the direction that the camera is facing. And like any other object in Blender, we can do Alt-R to clear the rotation, Alt-S, Alt-G to clear the location and scale as well. Once again, viewport shortcuts on the viewport shortcuts in Blender. Numpad 1 for front view, Numpad 3 for side view, Numpad 7 for top view, and the 5 on the numpad is switching between perspective and orthographic. So at the moment this is effectively a reference image for top down. So if we were to click Z and go wireframe shading, we can grab this object, G for grab, Y for the Y axis, and move that so it looks centered for the base of the object. Again, if you were to hit Control 7, that would actually get you the bottom view. So that's probably better for what we were wanting. So again, like any other object in Blender, we can hit R to rotate, we can hit Y to constrain that to the Y axis, and we can rotate that 180 degrees by typing in 180. So now if we were to hit Control 7, that will be the base of our object, and the axis just needs to be lined up a little better, like that. Now, of course, while we have this image centered, it's not necessarily to scale. And given that a pepper grinder is quite small, I'm going to guess that the default size of this object as an image that Blender has brought in is quite large. So if we add in a mesh, cube, N key, we can set the scale of that mesh to be 0.01 of a meter, which will give us a little 1 centimeter cube. And we can see that the reference image is quite large. So this is a scenario where if we select the object, it'll scale based on the object's pivot point, which is in the center. However, because we've already got it centered where we want it, this would be a scenario where if we change the transform pivot point to 3D cursor, which again is the red and white circle with the crosshairs, we can now scale this in using Control or Control Shift as well, and just make sure that one centimeter as a cube is the scale it needs to be for 1 centimeter in the scene. So now that that is to scale, we don't need this anymore. We don't need our default cube, which is usually put in at 2 by 2 by 2 meters. Not useful for our small pepper grinder. Control 7 for underneath. If we select this object, Shift D, that will give us a duplicate. So we can now set that to front view, RX to rotate along the x-axis, bring that up 90 degrees, rotate along the z-axis so we can bring it into view 180, and then we can line this up with the ground plane. Again, any cylindrical object, because there is perspective distortion, just try to go for the center line of where that object would be touching the ground, just to make things a bit easier for yourself. So now we've got our 2 reference images. You don't really need to, because this is a cylindrical object, but if we wanted to Shift D again and rotate that one around 90 degrees, we would then have a front reference and a side reference, but being a cylinder, that's not strictly necessary for this object. So now that we've got both of those images in there, we can do Shift A, add mesh cylinder, keeping in mind that we can set how many different segments there are in this little menu down the bottom here. Set that to, say, 16 is probably fine for an object of this size. Scale that to 0.1 just to get it a bit closer. Scale, and that looks to be about right there. So if I hold Control and Shift to constrain that, that will give us an actual increment. But yeah, it depends on the object and how accurate that needs to be. From here, we would then bring that up, so that's sitting on the base. You can any selection here will also have their average transform locations show up in the numerical part on the side here. So just to make sure that's sitting on the ground, we can set that to 0. And then from here, it's a matter of bringing that in, extruding another loop, scale that. That scale is still set to our 3D cursor in the center here. So if that was set back to the default of median point, that will now scale around the average points on our selection. So I would then go to Edges, select Control R to cut in new loops. Alt S can inflate along the normals. So Alt S with those 2 edge loops selected can inflate those out. Minimize that there. Go back to faces. And if we were to go back to solid mode, so Z to bring up the pie menu, back to solid, we'd see we've got the starting point of our pepper grinder there. So again, keeping an eye on which parts would need the most detail, where the smoothing sort of makes sense, not going too crazy with the polys, and continue the mesh all the way up until we've got the top, and then come in and put the bottom detail as well. That may be easier to see in wireframe view. But that's the basics of how to add reference images to your scene and begin making your object. So, some notes about the first assignment. The first assignment will be basically picking a simple object that you can find around either on campus or at home, so you can able to pick it up, look at it, or if it's a larger object, take photos of it from different angles to get reference, and basically just create the low poly model. So we'll talk more about high poly modeling and different techniques for that later on. But for the first assignment, if you were to pick something simple like a cup, doesn't have to be a cup, the one on the left is got a suitable amount of detail for this particular assignment. The one on the right is basically a cylinder with the bottom tapered in a bit, so that's a bit too simple. Similarly with these examples here, if you were to pick a TV cabinet, at least some detail on the handles, and then different legs, different tapers, bevels, just to make sure that you've used some of the tools, because once again this is pretty much 3 cubes stretched and put next to each other, so that's a bit too simple for this project. Once again, garbage can. This one is effectively just a cylinder, whereas these two have a more suitable amount of detail. If you're going to pick something along these lines, again, for furniture, this particular object would be a reasonable amount of detail. For the chords, you might not have to worry about that, but how I would generally go about it is create a cylinder, scale it way down, and then just extrude the face out a bit. But just creating the lamp without the 2 little chords might be alright. Again, with the chords, if you were to add them in, it would be very easy to accidentally have way too many polygons. So keeping an eye on the poly count is important. So if this was extruded from a cylinder, you might only have 6 sides to that cylinder rather than, bringing it in at the default 24 or 32, because the polygons would rack up quite high for something that is just a very small detail on that mesh. There is also more detail about assignment 1 on the course information booklet page. So if you look that up, there'll be some further guidelines and some more specifics about the project. We will also require the object, the low poly object, to be unwrapped and a single texture applied to it. That hasn't been covered in this lecture, but we will certainly get to that next week. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask them in the practical or in the allotted time, where I'll be able to respond via emails and follow up any further questions you might have. For the practical, we'll jump into a couple of little example pieces, and you will be able to find them linked on the page with the course information booklet. Thank you.